All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the UC Santa Barbara Natural Reserve System Fall Virtual Seminar Series. Thank you for joining us tonight. If you're in the Santa Barbara area, I hope that you're enjoying all this wonderful rain that we're getting. I can almost hear the ground soaking it all up. So what a wonderful treat that we're getting here in California. And if you're not in our rain cloud here, then I hope the weather wherever you are is great. Um, Tonight, we are very excited to present to you from the Santa Cruz Island Reserve, and we've got an excellent speaker coming to us to speak about bees. So this is our second week in a row with some bee talks, so make sure you get your questions warmed up, and I think you're going to be in for a real great treat tonight. My name is Marianne Whitman. I'm the Executive Director of the UC Santa Barbara Natural Reserve System, and I get the pleasure of working with all of the reserve directors that oversee our different sites. Tonight, we've got Dr. Jay Reti, who's the director of the Santa Cruz Island Reserve, who will tell you a little bit about what's going on at the reserve tonight, and then we'll also introduce our speaker. Before we get into program, I wanted to just, of course, go over a little bit about how the evening will go, talk a little bit about the NRS, and then we'll dig right in. So first, a little bit about format. We're going to start with about a 15-minute or so presentation by Jay, as I mentioned, about the reserve. Then we'll have about 25 minutes or so with our featured speaker tonight, Dillon Travis. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A session, and that's where you all get to interact with us. And so once again, I'll go over just how you do that. And when you're on your computer or however you're watching this webinar, if you look at the bottom of the screen, there is the Zoom Control Center, and there's a button down there for you called Q&A. And that's where we'd love for you to type in your questions for either Dillon or for Jay about the reserve or about the talk that you heard tonight. So I'll moderate the Q&A, and I'll try to get to all of your questions. We usually get so much every night, so we'll do what we can, but we really look forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions about what you're hearing tonight. This presentation is available in closed captioning, so you can go ahead and enable that on your side, again, in the Zoom Control Center at the bottom of your screen. And also tonight's presentation will be recorded and posted to the UC Santa Barbara Natural Reserve System YouTube page. So make sure you check it out there. If you missed anything tonight, or if you'd like to share it with your friends or colleagues, then that would be great. All right, so first, just a little quick introduction about the Natural Reserve System. And again, I think that the Natural Reserve System is one of the greatest things that the University of California has to offer. And what it is it's a set of 41 sites distributed across the state of California, and each UC campus manages a handful of them. And all of these reserves are set aside for the unique purpose of research, education, public service, and land stewardship. And we use this opportunity to add value to these places by really allowing for discovery, exploration, science, classes, learning, everything under the sun, you name it. So really excited tonight, as I mentioned before, to come to you from the Santa Cruz Island Reserve to let you know a little bit about what we do there. And so with that, I'll pass it over to you, Jay, and why don't you get us started?
Great. Thanks so much, Marianne. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm really excited for the talk tonight. Yeah, I hope you all have been enjoying this rain. We did get some rain out on the island, which means I'm going to predict that tomorrow I'm getting a bunch of emails from our mushroom researchers who are going to be really excited to get out there and explore. So before we get into Dillon's talk tonight, which I'm excited to introduce, I wanted to give you a few updates and introduce you to the Santa Cruz Island Reserve if you're not familiar with it yet. But before we do that, I want to quickly provide a very important acknowledgement, which is that Santa Cruz Island, or LIMU, is the homeland of the Chumash people, and we do pay our respects to the Chumash people, past, present, and future. So they hold the memories, the traditions, and the culture of Santa Cruz Island, which has become a place of learning for people from all over the world. And I will talk about that later on in the talk as well. We have some very meaningful and wonderful outreach and collaboration with our local Chumash colleagues. So one of the questions I get a lot is, what is the Santa Cruz Island Reserve, right? There's a lot of different organizations that are at play in the Channel Islands. Santa Cruz Island itself is owned by the National Park Service, which is the eastern part of the island. The western 3/4 of the island is owned by the Nature Conservancy, and UC Santa Barbara, the Natural Reserve System, the Santa Cruz Island Reserve, operates with the Nature Conservancy with long-term cooperative agreements. So we handle a lot of the research and the education and the public service that happens on the island. So basically, the boundaries that we have there for research are also the Nature Conservancy boundaries. So many of you have probably been out to the national park property, going out to Scorpion Harbor. If you haven't, you should. It's amazing. You can camp out there. You can do day trips out there. You can do hiking. You can also go to Prisoners Harbor, which is in the center of the screen here. And that is also owned by the National Park Service. There are some hikes you can do from there as well. And to get into the Nature Conservancy property and to the Santa Cruz Island Reserve, you drive about 3.5 miles into the interior parts of the island, and you get to our beautiful field station, which is coming up on its 50th formal anniversary next year. That's 2023. This was, established 1966 as a little tent camp, but formally added to the National Reserve System in 1973. So 50 years, thousands of dissertations, hundreds of thousands of user days out there, people learning and exploring and conducting research. And a lot has happened in that time. So stay tuned for our 50th anniversary news. We have a lot of fun things going on for that too. The field station is located in the Central Valley of the island. When you're there, you don't know you're on an island, right? It feels much more like internal California, right? It can get very hot in the summer, very cold in the winter, very different than the coastal environments around the island. We can host upwards of 40 people at the field station. We are completely self-contained with water, solar power, our vehicle fleet, and it's a very wonderful, warm place to be. And if you've been lucky enough to go there and sit around the fire, you know that it's a very collegial place to work. Dillon, who'll be talking tonight, has come out so many times based on the scope of his research. Spent a lot of time at the field station and all across the island. So I just want to give you a little tour here. The island is huge, right? We're talking on our portion where the research happens. It's about 45,000 acres or so. It's a very large place, very topographically diverse, very much like mainland California in a lot of ways in a lot of these environments. This is the main valley, which is the Santa Cruz Island Fault. It is an active fault line. It runs all the way out towards the west side of the island at Christie Ranch. If you keep going, this is the farthest western point on the island, Fraser Point. It's a very, very different place. Fraser Point tends to be foggy and windswept, very craggy and rough, cold waters, but very pristine intertidal and subtidal ecosystems with long-term monitoring projects there. We've seen a resurgence of black abalone, a very different kind of relationship between urchins and kelp and many other intertidal species out here. So it's a very, very fascinating place. We have a lot of groups that have done work for 40, 50 years in these areas. The south side of the island, on the other hand, tends to look more like Baja. It's much warmer, sandy beaches as opposed to the rocky northern and western coasts. Very different plant communities and very different intertidal ecosystems as well. Along these varied ecosystems on the island. We have a lot of research projects and a lot of student engagement in research projects. This picture here represents one of our long-term collaborators, which is Paso Robles High School, who's been coming out to the island since about 1990 and gives students an opportunity to actually engage in meaningful data collection and research on the island. Here they're studying Stipa pulchra, a purple needlegrass, native bunch grass on the island, and how well it's doing over very long terms, decades, compared to invasive grasses. A couple of really important updates. Last year, if you attended our talk, I talked a little bit about our plans and our hopes for climate monitoring on the island. We are thrilled to announce that we've received funding from the Moore Foundation, and we are going to be expanding our climate monitoring across the island in the coming 2 years. So this is a fog harp, measures fog and how much fog condenses and drips down to a gauge below. We're really interested in changing fog patterns and changing weather patterns in general across the island. This is important both for island species, endemic species that are only found on Santa Cruz Island. In the face of climate change, where are there refugia for these plants to go? Where should we invest our time for land stewardship and conservation? And it's also important because the island is as close to a natural lab as you get, especially for ecosystems in California. So by understanding microclimates on the island, we can take that and we can bring that back to the mainland, and that helps us to understand climate change in mainland California. It helps us to understand the behaviors potentially of fire and fire propagation. We can refine our models that we use for these things on the mainland, on the island. So we're really excited about what's coming up here in the next couple of years as we take the existing climate monitoring that we're doing and expand it across the island and across the region with our partners, including the Nature Conservancy, NOAA, and the Navy, and our other sites within the UCSB NRF, like the Sedgwick Reserve, Polo Hill Point Reserve, Carpinteria Salt Marsh Reserve, where there is weather stations currently. We also have ongoing funding to support teacher training and diversity education on the island by exposing high school kids, community college students, and undergraduate students to field science and research. So here we have a group of students out on Christie Beach, and they are working on controlling invasive ice plant in the dunes, and looking at how hand removal of ice plant can affect native plant communities and see how effective that kind of mitigation effort is. By doing this, they get to learn specific species of plants, specific ecosystems, and over time get to see the impact of the work that they're doing. We also have received ongoing foundation grants to support Chumash outreach. So we have partnered with the Chumash Foundation, the Lou Lapin Foundation, to bring groups of Chumash elders, youth, linguistic experts out to the island quarterly. We have another trip coming up here in just a couple of weeks. And it's been hugely rewarding and just a really, really wonderful program that we are looking to continue and expand. It's also been a great year coming kind of out of COVID with we've been very, very busy on the island with research in general, but we have been lucky enough to partner with lots of artists, including a group led by Carolina Karlik from UC Santa Cruz called Unseen California. And these artists are photographers, they're painters, they are multimedia artists. And here, Carolina is installing a copper panel that interacts with fog on the south side of the island, and will get a patina, get a coloration change as it kind of oxidizes with interaction with water. And it's been really wonderful to work with these artists. We're working on some potential events for our 50th anniversary next year that highlight art that we're very excited about. And we are looking at early in 2023 to host our first artist in residence, which will most likely be a Chumash artist. And I will provide some updates on that as we move forward too. Very excited about moving beyond just kind of our very rigorous science background, but expanding into kind of the STEAM world, including art in collaboration with science on the island. And I'd just like to thank all of our partners. We work with so many different groups on the island so collaboratively that it's absolutely a team effort to be in a remote place out in the channel like that. So I've seen some names that are on this webinar tonight from these organizations. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to working with all of you into the future. Before I end here and turn it over to Dillon, I also want to plug, we currently have, it's called a Gaucho Boost, which is the UCSB crowdsourced fundraiser for our students. So Santa Cruz Island is so unique. And I think for most of you that are here to enjoy this talk, you know this. It is an absolutely one-of-a-kind place on this planet. I was lucky enough to be a high school student coming out to Santa Cruz Island. It absolutely changed the direction of my career and exposed me to field science. And I've been lucky enough to see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students come out to the island, some of them camping for the first time, hiking for the first time, pulling a meter tape for the first time, understanding these environments, from a very, very, just a place of absolute intrigue and interest. It's one of my favorite parts of this job is seeing the impact it has on students. But it is remote, so students have to travel to get to Ventura. They have to get on a boat. They have to get to the island. There's food for long periods of time. There's costs associated with staying at the field station and having trucks and fuel. And we are working to help offset those costs so that we can support as many students as we can at the field station. So if you're interested in supporting that, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's a wonderful cause that will help hundreds and hundreds more students come out to Santa Cruz Island. We also have general donations. We are always looking for support for infrastructure, for kind of the next phase of research on the island. And I would be happy to share more information about that with any of you that are interested. So thank you so much for your time. I'm really looking forward to introducing Dillon now and hearing what he has to say about gauging the impact of abundant non-native honeybees on native pollinator communities, a mainland-island comparison. So I'm going to give a brief bio for Dillon and then turn it over to him. Dillon is a biology PhD candidate, broadly interested in the impact of invasive Western honeybees on native plants and pollinator communities in Southern California. In his previous work, Dillon has shown that honeybee pollination produces plants that are less fit compared to plants produced by native insect pollination. He's also shown that on the most abundantly blooming plants, honeybees make up greater than 90% of all flower visitors, and they remove the lion's share, about 95%, of pollen each day, which could have been used to rear native bees and other pollinators. So please join me in welcoming Dillon Travis.
Thanks for the intro, Jay. Let me get my screen up for y'all. All right, is that looking okay? Yes, excellent. All right, so my name is Dillon. I am a 6th year PhD candidate at UC San Diego. And my research, as Jay said, is broadly interested in gauging the impacts of honeybees on native pollinator communities, as well as native plant communities. Today, I'm going to talk about specifically the work that I've done on Santa Cruz Island, essentially comparing native bee abundance and diversity in the presence and absence of honeybees. So, if you didn't know, we are in the California floristic province. The majority of the state is. It's a biodiversity hotspot that starts in southern Oregon and makes its way down all the way into northern Baja California, Mexico. What's interesting about this region is its amazing diversity of plant species and animals, although a large proportion of these animals and plants are endangered due to habitat degradation and removal as more people begin to live here. So Today, I'm going to talk about Southern California, specifically this region down over here. As you can see, the big red spot is the urban sprawl. And so we've lost a large proportion of the plant community or the ecosystems here in Southern California. But I'll talk about some reserves. So what's really cool about this area, like I said, there's over 2,000 plant species. Many of them are endemic to the region. This is due to our really mild Mediterranean climate along the coast. And not only do we have this amazing diversity of plant species, but we also have a myriad of native bee species. In fact, Southern California is home to at least 700 native bee species. It's one of the most diverse counties in the country and probably one of the most diverse places in the world for native bees. And so I have a bumblebee on the left, and then on the right, that's a carpenter bee picture that I took in my parents' yard in East LA County. Here are some more bees. So here's a bunch of pictures of bee faces that I've taken. As you can see, the majority of bees look nothing like what you would typically expect a bee to look like. Usually I ask students to draw a bee for me, and they all draw either bumblebees or honeybees. But as you can see, they come in all different shapes, sizes, and colors. There is one insect on this slide that is not a bee, and it's a bee fly. And it's this bottom, the second one from the right here, the very bottom row. That's a bee fly, which is a type of parasite of ground nesting bees. So we have this amazing diversity of insects, specifically bees, that pollinate the myriad of plants that we have here. Yet, if you were to go out and look at flowers in the native ecosystems around here, I guarantee the very first insect that you're going to see is Apis mellifera, which is the Western honeybee. The Western honeybee is native to Western Eurasia in Africa. So in this map right here, it's the blue regions that they're native to, and they've been introduced everywhere in red. They are eusocial, which means that they have a queen and several thousand sterile workers. The vast majority of native bees are solitary and not eusocial, so they don't have queens. All the females can have babies, and essentially they make their own nests. They don't really interact with each other. They don't make honey or anything like that. Another interesting thing about honeybees is that they're super generalists. So they visit many flower types, which is very important for things like agriculture and why they've been essentially introduced to every single continent except for Antarctica. So this is specifically in in San Diego County, but if you were to go out and just stare at a flower, you would find that honeybees account for about 75% of all floral visitors in unmanaged habitats. And on the most abundantly blooming plants, honeybees can account for greater than 90% of all the floral visitors. And this is despite there being this amazing diversity of native pollinators here. Why is this? Well, honeybees have this amazing ability to recruit their nestmates to the location of floral resources via the waggle dance. If you haven't seen a video of it, I definitely suggest looking at them. People have taken amazing videos. Essentially, by doing this little dance in their hive, they can convey both distance and direction to their nestmates. So they're very efficient at recruiting their nestmates, and they're very good at extracting resources from the environment. So as honeybees become the abundant visitor to a plant, native pollinators tend to visit less flowers per plant, which suggests there's some resource competition between these two groups. On the graph on the left here, this is a literature review of all the different papers that have measured flower visits per plant for honeybees and non-honeybees as a function of honeybee abundance on the x-axis. And as you can see, as honeybees become more dominant, everything else that isn't a honeybee visits significantly less flowers per plant. Honeybees visit just in general more flowers per plant compared to the average native pollinator, which may increase the self-fertilization rate. And in one of my other thesis chapters, I found that for abundant native plants like white sage here in SoCal, honeybee pollination produced seedlings that were 2 to 10 times less fit compared to seedlings following native insect or cross-pollination. And by fitness, what I mean is survival to adulthood, germination probability, the general size that you're going to grow to. So these are all factors that are very important to survive in the environment. And so honeybees produced individuals that were less fit. compared to native insects. In another chapter of my thesis, I looked at pollen removal. And so on abundantly blooming plants in San Diego County, honeybees remove about 70% of all the available pollen daily. If you were to look at a 1 hectare patch of black sage, which is a very common and abundant plant in San Diego, honeybees remove about 32 grams of pollen each day, which if you turn that into native bees is about enough pollen to rear 950 native bees of average size every single day. And the average native bee is about half the size of a honeybee. So most of them are super small. So there's this amazing impact here. So this kind of brings us to my main question, which is how do these super abundant honeybees impact native Southern California pollinators? This study it takes place on Santa Cruz Island. I'll get to that in a second, but also in the Santa Monica Mountains. So if you were to measure or study the impact of honeybees, you need to get rid of honeybees from the environment. We have no baseline of what the population of native insects looked like before honeybees. They were introduced in the 1800s. And honeybees are very ubiquitous in our environment. They're feral colonies, which are just like in the rocks around in the environment. And there's a lot of hobby beekeepers and agriculture in the area as well. So I can't go around killing bees on the mainland, but we have this really cool place called Santa Cruz Island. So why Santa Cruz Island? Well, so honeybees, like I said, were introduced to California in the mid 1800s and to Santa Cruz Island by the 1880s. They were going to have like this honeybee production company on the island, but that was quickly just abandoned. And so they left all the hives there. So like I mentioned, I guess, again, I forgot that I had put this on the slide. Honeybees are everywhere in our native ecosystems. They can fly for about 10 miles from their hive and come back. So it's really hard to experimentally remove them from the environment without killing someone's backyard hive or killing an agricultural hive. The way that you would get rid of these honeybees is usually through poisoning them. And so they would bring back poisoned nectar or pollen to feed to the queen, which would ultimately die. So in line with other exotic animal removal programs on Santa Cruz Island, honeybees were effectively eradicated on the island by 2004. So this really this amazing thing that happened allows us to compare native pollinator communities in the presence and the absence of honeybees. So geologically, Santa Cruz Island and the Santa Monica Mountains are the same formation. Another very interesting thing is that this range runs from east to west, while the vast majority of mountain ranges go from north to south, and that's because of this like amazing geological events that occurred there. You can kind of see that they're more or less in line with each other. So I chose the Santa Monica Mountains as my Santa Cruz Island analog in terms of the number of plants and the variety of species that are present there. So while the island has a very unique floral community, essentially every single plant present on the island has a mainland analog. So for example, there's a few species of endemic buckwheats to the island, specifically like the giant island buckwheat. The analog on the mainland would be the California buckwheat, Eriogonum californica. They're both visited in high numbers by native insects. And the same is generally true for the pollinator species present on the island and the mainland. They tend to be relatively the same. There may be some island endemics, but overall, any genus that's represented on the island is also represented in the mainland. So my primary objective was to determine if native non-honeybee pollinators were more abundant in the absence of honeybees. So in order to do this, I had 5 sites on the mainland and 5 inland sites. They're marked here by these pink little dots. On the mainland, I primarily was in California state parks, but I also was at another UC Reserve Stunt Ranch that's managed by UCLA. And then on the island, I had 5 sites that I tried to get as close as possible to the mainland sites in terms of general plant diversity and geologic habitat as well, because a lot of bees nest in the ground. So I kind of wanted them to be the soil to be relatively the same in both places. So at each site, I defined a 1 hectare plot in a biodiverse area to conduct floral and pollinator abundance surveys. A hectare is 100 meters by 100 meters. And every 2 weeks from February to June, we ran two 50-meter by 2-meter transects per plot at each site. And these transects were placed in areas where I try to get like a general, let's say, vibe for the hectare. Obviously, I wasn't doing this randomly because there'd be a possibility of me running a transect where there are no flowers. So I try to get just a general gauge of what was going on in the hectare with each transect. So for every transect, we estimated floral abundance of each blooming species, and how we did that. So this is like the number of flowers per transect. We multiplied the number of individual plants per transect of a particular species by the average number of inflorescences per plant, which is like a flower stalk that has multiple flowers on it, and then multiplied this again by the average number of flowers per inflorescence. And so this gave us an estimate of floral abundance for every single species on the transect. And this is kind of what a typical transect looks like or looked like. This is Leo Correa State Park in Malibu. And this was, I think, taken in March or maybe April. There's some deerweed on the left of the transect, as well as some a nightshade species. And then in the foreground, there's a Encelia californica, which is a species of sunflower that's native here. And in the very back, there's some Brassica nigra, which is black mustard, an invasive plant that's very ubiquitous in our environments as well. So once we had an idea of what flowers were on the transects and the general abundance of these flowers, we were interested in also estimating pollinator abundance. So for each transect, we walked and described or recorded the number of native insects and the flowers that they were visiting on. And the transects would take, we spent 15 minutes on every single transect so that the amount of effort that we put on each transect was the same across all sites across time. I did this project this year. I tried to do it last year, but it was unsuccessful. And I am now a 6th-year PhD student. So I'm also not an entomologist. So it's really hard to identify the majority of flying insects to species without collecting them. And even if you collect them, it could take years to ID all of them to species. So instead, we devised categories for the various pollinators that we expected to see. So category number 1, apis, honeybees. Number 2 is bombus, which is our bumblebees. These are very easy to tell. A bumblebee is very obvious compared to a lot of other insects that are out here. And then we have 2 other categories that are a little bit more vague, one being large-bodied bees and metallic bees. And then another category, small bees. Hoverflies, bee flies, and coleopterans, hemipterans, which are beetles and true bugs. And then lastly, lepidopterans, which are your butterflies, moths, skippers, and things like that. So I'm going to go through some of these just to give you a definition of what these groups are and what bees they define. First, we'll go through these large-bodied bees and metallic bees. So large-bodied bees are bees that are either similar in size to honeybees or a little bit larger or significantly larger. I'm not going to read out the genera that fall into this category, but here's some pictures of bees that would fall in this category. So on the top left, your classic carpenter bee, the genus is Xylocopa. And then the bottom right is a type of cactus specialist or a mallow specialist in the genus Diadasia. And then the other 2 we won't go into. So metallic bees are bees with metallic integument, which is often blue, green, purple, or black. So here's some pictures of those, what you would expect to see here. This group is a little bit more vague in terms of it kind of encompasses not only very specific families, but specific genera or even specific species in a family that I have listed here on the left for the bee nerds out there. Here is another insect that's pretty common. This is a bee fly. So it's a species of fly. It's not a bee. They're hairy-like bees, though. People often call them fairy pollinators, and they are nest parasites of ground nesting bees. But the adults eat nectar and pollen for their diets. So they are pollinators. They visit flowers. So this is a classic one I guarantee you'll probably see in your garden, Bombleus major. They're pretty cool, very flighty. They're kind of hard to get around. It was a very cold morning that I took this picture. And so if it's very cold, their metabolism's slowed down and they'll just hang out on you. The next group is hoverflies, which again is a species of fly. So instead of being hairy like a bee, they have the similar coloration as bees, so this yellow and black. They're also pollinators. This specific individual, this species right here, I can't remember off the top of my head, has almost a global like range, because they often get trapped in the jet stream and then just kind of fall out wherever the jet stream shoots them out. So I spend a lot of time looking at flowers and bees. So it would be terrible if I didn't show you some of the pictures that I took of the flowers out here. So on the left, this big purple bush right here is a bush lupin that is on the island. These are probably one of the most common species of plants, especially in the Central Valley. Some of them can be absolutely massive, like 6 feet tall or even taller. Like some of these bushes of lupins, which I usually expect to be ankle high, are like 7 feet tall. The top picture that looks like a sunflower is the giant coreopsis, which is a plant that looks like it comes out of Jurassic Park. It has almost like a tree trunk that these really succulent leaves come out of. And then all of a sudden this honkin' sunflower comes out of it, which is like not what you would expect. Some other pictures around here, I have the one right below the sunflower, the giant coreopsis, is it's a huge field of deerweed that's blooming all at the same time. Obviously, it's completely covered in bees. The top right is black sage and then a red penstemon. And then the bottom is Hesperia yucca whipplei, one of the native Hesperia yuccas here in Southern California. So amazing diversity of flowers and also of pollinating insects. I love bees specifically, so I'm going to show you specifically pictures of bees. So on the left, you have a species of supposedly cactus and mallow specialists, but it's visiting a penstemon. This is a cactus bee, I would call them. The picture of the bee on my thumb is a longhorned bee in the genus Eucera. The males have these super long antennae that they use to find females, because essentially antennae are like the noses of insects. Really cool thing about male bees or boy bees is that they can't sting. The stinger is a modified egg-laying device, so only females can sting. Boy bees cannot sting. So all the honeybees that you see out foraging on plants are all females, and that's why they can all sting you. On the right, you have a mallow specialist, another type of cactus bee. It's a little bit smaller than the one on the left. And then right below that, you have a metallic bee that's on one of the most abundant species in the Central Valley of Santa Cruz Island, which is, I think the common name is blue dix. Although it's purple, I don't get it, but you have like a metallic bee on that plant. All right, so let's go ahead and start looking at numbers and graphs. Oh, actually, you know what? I forgot. I have some videos here. So I mentioned that honeybees are eusocial, so they have a hive, they have a queen and workers, while the vast majority of other bees are solitary. So there are different degrees of solitariness that are out there. Some bees do not interact with any of their cousins or like relatives at all, but some bees nest in massive aggregations, this one being some cactus bees. So hopefully the video is not too choppy, but these are tens of thousands of cactus bees flying around, foraging and then provisioning their nest cells in the ground here. Zoom in. All right. Another video of these ground bees. This is a mating ball. So the male bees come out first and they forage a little bit, but their primary operative is to mate and then essentially die. So as soon as they come out, they're like waiting for the females. And right when the females come out of their nests, they immediately try to mate with them. And so this is a mating ball. So you can only see the males, but in the center of this huge ball is a female that they're all trying to mate with. I don't know if this may be TMI, but unfortunately the female in this group of bees was dead at the end of this whole thing. The males were a little bit too excited. They tend to be pretty aggressive with each other, and they end up kind of ripping apart some of the females sometimes, which is kind of brutal, but so it goes. So yes, now let's look at some results. First things first, on the mainland, we observed 2,030 honeybees and about 3,200 native insects. So 40% of all flower visitors were honeybees, which is a lot less than what we see in San Diego. In San Diego, if you remember, we see about 75% of all flower visitors are honeybees, which is good news for the Santa Monica Mountains. And then on the island, we observed about 2,200 native insects. So here are some graphs. Hopefully these are really easy to interpret here. So the bottom line is that there were significantly more native insects per flower on Santa Cruz Island compared to the mainland. So the graph on the left is on the y-axis is the number of non-apis insects per flower on a transect. I just pooled all the species of plants together. And the reddish color on the bottom here on the left is the mainland, and on the right is Santa Cruz Island in blue. So there's a decent difference in the average number of non-apis insects per flower on a transect for Santa Cruz Island. The graph on the right is similar, but instead of pooling all of the species of plants together, this is for every single species on the transect. So there's a lot more data points. But again, we still see the same effect of there being significantly more native insects per flower on Santa Cruz Island compared to the mainland. But there were significantly more flowers and more non-honeybee insects per transect on the mainland. So the graph on the left is the estimated number of flowers per transect for the mainland and Santa Cruz Island. And as you can see, there were a lot more flowers per transect on the mainland than on Santa Cruz Island. And then on the right is just the number, on the y-axis is the number of non-apis insects, which are your native insects that aren't honeybees per transect. So just summed up. There is slightly more on the mainland versus Santa Cruz Island, although the difference wasn't statistically significant. So I do think that this is probably what's driving this first graph here, or my first result. It's just that there's way less flowers on Santa Cruz Island compared to the mainland. So this is just pulling all native non-apis insects together. Let's look at some of the categories I had. So there was no significant difference in the number of small bees and hoverflies per flower between Santa Cruz Island and the mainland, but we did see more small bees and hoverflies per transect on the mainland. So on the left is a graph of the number of small bees per transect for the mainland and island, and the difference was significant. There was more small bees per transect on the mainland. I think that's because of the difference. There's this different species present on the mainland versus the island in different abundances. So I think, I don't know if people are familiar with the plant it's in the genus Phacelia. There's Phacelia distans and Cicutaria. These are pretty common plants that bees love, especially small bees. Very abundant plant in the Santa Monicas, while I did not see really any of them on Santa Cruz Island. And on the right is the number of hoverflies per transect on the mainland and island. There were a lot more hoverflies on the mainland, although primarily they were visiting Brassica nigra, which is an invasive mustard species, both on the mainland and island. There's a lot less of it on the island compared to the mainland. So again, that may be what's driving this difference. So there was no difference in the number of visitors per flower between the island and the mainland for essentially everything else, but I'm going to go through each one. So the first one is bumblebees. I didn't see any difference in the number of bumblebees per flower between the two super sites. Same with large bees, metallic bees, bee flies, beetles and bugs, and butterflies and moths. And essentially the factors that I think have influenced that, despite what including what I've already said, is that the 2020 to 2021 rainy season was the driest season on Santa Cruz Island in the last century. So I originally tried to do this project last year, and I came out in February, in March, and there was literally almost nothing blooming except for some few plants in the Central Valley where a lot of the water runs to. But the same problem was on the mainland as well. It was very dry. This past rainy season was also below average for precipitation, although the island got as much rain as they did in the previous year in December. I think it was like 6 inches or something. So below average, but not as bad. And essentially what I think is happening is that it's likely that the native pollinator community has not rebounded from the drought yet. they don't have these large perennial colonies. These bees are only alive for maybe 5 weeks maximum, and then they die. So that's the amount of time they have to provision their nests. And so if there's less flowers, that means you're going to have less offspring. So if I were to continue doing this work, I think that it would be really cool to explore other regions on the mainland that may have a more similar plant assemblage as on Santa Cruz Island. I know researchers do work in Lompoc, where some of my family's actually from. Supposedly that area is quite similar in plant assemblages as on the island. So both pollinator communities and flowers are extremely variable through space-time. So every single year it's very variable. So it would be really cool to repeat the study every single year for like 2 decades to see what was up. Lastly, it would be really important to actually compare not only abundance, but diversity of pollinating species on Santa Cruz Island to the mainland. So this would mean that you would have to collect the species and ID them to the species level, which I did not do. I didn't collect any insects. So in summary, honeybees are really abundant on the mainland. They're virtually impossible to exclude from a study area on the mainland. So Santa Cruz Island fixes this problem since they eradicated their honeybees 20 years ago about. In general, we observed more native pollinators per flower in the absence of honeybees compared to when or where they are present on the mainland. Although this is probably driven by the number of flowers per transect, because there was a lot more flowers on the mainland than in the island. There was no single pollinator that was more abundant on the island versus the mainland, or there was no single pollinator that was more abundant per flower on the island versus the mainland. So I do think we need a lot more studies to confidently determine the impact of honeybees on native pollinator visitation in Southern California. And with that, I am at the end of my talk. Thank you so much for listening. And here's some of my funding resources and a lot of the people that have helped me with this work as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Dillon, so much. That talk with the bee's knees. I wanted to just remind everybody real quick about the Q&A again. Remember, type in your questions. We already have a couple that are coming in. I'm just I'll get started with my own question. I was curious as to, you might have said this in your talk, but if you have a greater assemblage of non-native plants, does that do the non-native bees dominate when your landscape is dominated by non-native plants? So maybe you observe some of that in your mainland island comparison.
Yeah.
That may be a big question, but maybe you could speak to that.
Mm-hmm. So honeybees will focus all of their attention on the most abundant resource available. So for a lot of the mainland, it's going to be like this black mustard, which is invasive. They love that plant. But when it doesn't occur, and then on the island, you have the fennel that if there were honeybees, they would be all over it. While you would think that native bees wouldn't visit these invasive plants, they do. And researchers on the island have looked and seen that buckwheats that are near these invasive fennels actually get more flower visitors in a day than they would if these other plants weren't present. But honeybees will forage on essentially whatever's the most abundant, regardless of if it's native or not. So in your yard, yeah, 100% they'll be there.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to turn out to the audience now a little bit. This first question is from Scott Cooper, and Scott asks, can you compare native bee and honeybee visitation rates on the same or similar plant species on the island versus mainland?
That is doable, yes. So I tried to do this last year, but the problem, so I try to use black sage, for example. So in Southern California, it's very abundant, at least in San Diego County. It's not as abundant in the Santa Monica Mountains, but it is absolutely like rare as heck on the island for some reason. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard to find like the exact same species that I can compare. I could do that with invasive plants, although that'd be super interesting to compare visitation rates between native insects on the island versus the mainland where there is honeybees, where there are honeybees present. I think that'd be interesting. But generally, as honeybees become more abundant, native insects visit less, which suggests competition between the two.
Well, Dillon, maybe you can tack on a few extra years to your PhD here and think about that for next year. Okay, so this next question is from Angel Ramirez. And Angel also gave a shout out to the UCSB Smithsonian Scholars Program. So I wanted to call that out too. It's an amazing program at UCSB out of the Office of Education Partnerships. So Angel asks, have you looked at the bees that live in the dirt up by Portezuela? They live in the road going up the big satellite dish. So tell us, Dillon, a little bit about bees that live in the dirt on the island.
Yeah. So those ones, the ones that are right on the trail are always going to be in the genus Diodasia, which are your cactus and mallow specialists. For some reason, they really like the hard, compacted soils. And so you don't see them where there's a lot of invasive grasses because the grasses kind of like make the soil very like organic. It's less dense.
Mm-hmm.
And so for some reason, you only find them on these trails. It's the same thing here in in San Diego County too. Any like hiking trail, these bees will be in the middle of the trail, which is stressful, but they seem to do fine.
Mm-hmm. They are social, I guess. Okay, so the next question brings us back to our island biogeography classes. And this is from Lisa Stratton. And Lisa asks, since Santa Cruz Island is an island, isn't the biodiversity of bees by definition less? And I guess that means compared to the mainland or a non-island location.
Yeah, I bet if so, yeah, you're limited by size, and the size of the island tends to determine the diversity of insects there. We don't really know, like there have been several studies that have tried to document all of the native bee species on Santa Cruz Island, although it's been a while since people have looked at that, and the lists are not necessarily complete. I would agree with you, though, that the island probably has less species, and that's why I was looking primarily at diversity or abundance and not diversity.
Mm-hmm.
An idea, this is not related to the question, I guess it kind of is that essentially larger bodied bees have higher energy requirements, so like your bumblebees or carpenter bees. And so those ones are the ones that are predicted to compete the greatest with honeybees. And so in the absence of honeybees on the island, you would expect to have more of these large-bodied bees. So more bumblebees, more carpenter bees, more of the longhorn bees and stuff like that. Although I did not see that in the data, but it would be interesting to look at that.
Okay, I'm going to ask another question too. So you showed in the beginning of your talk a slide that really showed the impact of the honeybees on the pollen, reserves, I guess, or the pollen that's out there. And so I just had kind of a general question. And again, this may be not easy to answer, but is pollen limited? Is there only so much pollen to go around such that the honeybees are causing like a negative or an unwanted effect?
Yeah. So I love talking about this because nectar is a renewable resource in the fact that you have a flower that's open in the beginning of the day, nothing's visited. It has a lot of nectar in it. The nectar gets depleted, but the plant continues to make nectar. Mm-hmm. That is not the case with pollen. Pollen is a non-renewable resource. So once the anthers, the male parts, have opened and the pollen has been removed, those anthers cannot produce any more pollen. Mm-hmm. So in a day, if you remove all of the pollen, there's no more pollen available that day. The next day there will be, but that day, nothing more.
Okay, so this question is a little bit about management. And this is from Kim and Wayne Lintz. And Kim and Wayne ask, how did they get rid of the honeybees on Santa Cruz Island?
There were several methods, but by far the most effective one was introducing a parasitic mite called Varroa destructor, which is a terrible like parasite of honeybees, and it almost like collapsed the entire honeybee economy like 25 years ago. And so they introduced that insect to, or this mite, it's not technically an insect, onto the island, it only will parasitize honeybees. And so that it really messes with their ability to, with their immune system. They get like a whole bunch of viruses, like deformed wing virus, and all of a sudden none of the bees can fly. And so they can't provision the hive. And so that's one of the best ways that they got rid of them, or the most intense way.
And I'm assuming you were saying that honeybees fly, 10 miles seems to be their kind of limit. So therefore, unless they're brought out, with humans, then they really don't have a way to get back to the island.
We hope. Lord knows what happens. I mean, things always end up out there. I was talking to someone about maybe there being, I just see a lot of yellow jackets on the island, and they're another eusocial creature. And whenever I see them, I'm like, oh my God, are those honeybees? And I'm like, oh, thankfully, I don't think so. So yeah, no way to get out there unless people bring them out, I think.
So there's a kind of related question from Susan King, and I think you just touched on this a little bit, but Susan asks, what's the impact on native bees by the Varroa? I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. The Varroa.
No, you got it. Yeah, Varroa destructor, which is the coolest name ever. So that mite was originally a parasite of Apis dorsata, which is an Asian honeybee. So there's like 13, 14 different species of honeybees. By far the most used one is Apis mellifera. And that map I showed you, it's all of like Western Eurasia and Africa. The mite used to be only on the Asian honeybee, and then somehow 25, 30 years ago, it jumped to the Western honeybee Apis mellifera. So there is no effect right now on the native bee population, and I hope it stays that way.
That's great. That's great. Okay. Now our next question is from Christina Walsh, and I'm certain to just annihilate the pronunciation of this, so bear with me. Christina wonders if you have observed Datura Reti on Santa Cruz Island, and then she asks which bees are involved.
Oh yes, Datura Reti, the sacred Datura. So what's an interesting thing about that plant? So if people who aren't familiar, it's during, I don't know, maybe like late spring, early summer, you'll see them on the side of the road all the time. They're these huge white flowers. It's like by far the largest native flower that we have here. What's a trip is that it's like 96% self-pollinated before the flower even opens. It like will just self-fertilize itself. Its pollinators, since it's a big white creamy colored flower, tend to always be moths. So not bees, but moths at night that have really long, what are those little things? Yeah, little straw mouths. I can't remember off the top of my, proboscis, there we go. I have seen honeybees foraging on them on the mainland, but on the island, I have seen nothing but pollen beetles, which eat the pollen. That's the only thing I see on them. No bees.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question, and this question is coming out from John Evarts, and John asks, when Dr. Adrian Wenner, who has done a lot of bee research on Santa Cruz Island, we're so lucky to have that line of research, first began removing honeybees from the island, it was somewhat controversial. Is there another site where honeybees can be removed on an island for research similar to this?
Catalina. I think there's still honeybees on Catalina. I mean, it's heavily degraded. It's a very degraded island, but that's another place where we could do it again. Yeah. My big dream is to go into the desert where there aren't any agricultural things going on and just try to nuke all of the honeybees there and see what happens over the next like couple of years with native bee diversity and abundance. But I don't think I'll ever get the okay to do that from the state.
All right. Well, I think we're just about out of time. We've got one more question, and we'll try to squeeze it in our last minute here. This is from Sophia Bennett Shore. Sophia asks, are there any native bees that have hives like honeybees, or are they all independent?
So bumblebees are primitively eusocial. So they also have a queen and sterile workers. They produce honey in a hive, although they don't produce it in those nice hexagonal nest cells. They have like these kind of like ugly, like little like pollen buckets. I don't know what else to call them.
Mhm.
So that there we have those, and then there's this a whole bunch of species of stingless bees that are native to southern Florida and the entirety of Latin America. And these bees don't have stingers, very tiny. They have big eusocial colonies too, and they produce honey, but again, not in those pretty little cells. It's like more nightmare looking. The inside of their colonies.
Interesting. All right. Well, there's so much to learn. Thank you, Dillon, for an excellent talk tonight. Thank you, Jay, for introducing us to Santa Cruz Island Reserve, where all this amazing research takes place. So this is our second to last seminar for the series. Please join us next week, Tuesday, November 15th. We're going to head back up to the mountains, where we're going to hear from Stephen Matthews of the U.S. Geological Survey, who's going to tell us about bi-state sage grouse, past, present, and future. So get your sage grouse hats on and be sure to tune in. And I hope everybody has a really lovely evening. Thank you again, Dillon, and thank you again, Jay. And thanks to everybody out there for joining us tonight. And we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.